Welcome to another Philosopher Wisdom Pod. We have Ivan Bock with us today. Ivan has a PhD in philosophy, so we're going to philosophize today. This podcast is brought to you by podper.com. If you want to start or scale your own podcast, go to podper.com. Ivan, welcome to the podcast itself. Tell me a bit more about what you're up to and what you're philosophizing about nowadays.
Yes, thanks so much for setting this up. As you said, Ivan Bock, technically I'm a PhD candidate at Stellenbosch University, so completing my thesis for my PhD, just to be clear. But yes, so I am a professional business analyst, which means I just kind of work in the IT industry full-time during the day. But other than that, I'm completing my PhD. I specialize in ethics, things like free will, moral psychology, virtue. These sort of topics is what I discuss, philosophize about, as you say.
Right. Well, okay, let's start with some of the stuff you occupy some of your brain space about nowadays. So let's start, for example, with virtue. What would be a better version of virtue than the Platonic and Aristotle version of virtues?
Great question. So, of course, Aristotle's conception of virtue is still highly influential, still very popular. And in that sense, at least, we're still going to stick pretty close, or at least my version of it will stick pretty close to the original. The big difference, and it's pretty popular topic these days, is within moral psychology. Aristotle's conception and Plato and the Stoics and the sort of ancient Greeks, they thought that virtue and virtuous character traits could be these robust, stable, consistent things, so that you're honest in every situation that calls for honesty, courageous for every situation that calls for courage. It seems modern psychology has kind of thrown a wrench in the cogs here, because it seems like that's just not how we work. We're very situationally influenced. We've got a bunch of heuristics and biases. So maybe that's the first thing that I would say, is that even though we'd stay close to the original conception of virtue as proper function or proper capacity, and these would be things like honesty and truth, perhaps we would have a much more realistic, more fallibilistic conception of virtue in people themselves. So the classic sage probably doesn't exist, and most of us can just kind of try and approximate virtue. This is all kinds of maybe repercussions for work and things, but we can talk about that if you want. Yeah.
So I have two dogs with me here, and one I sort of disciplined from a young age. The other was actually returned to us because he was misbehaving. So the first
Mm.
one I would describe as mid virtuous, and the second one I would describe as low virtue, namely
Yes.
that when he sees another bigger dog, he comes running in fear, but when he's with his older brother, he always bullies his brother, and he's smaller than his other brother. He's also smaller and less strong. Um,
Mm.
so is that me humanizing these dogs? Is there like such a thing as virtues and being brave and being not brave? Like, what is the value of bravery? If bravery can be stupid sometimes, if I am brave, I
Yes.
can get killed. What do you have to say about that?
Yes, great question. I mean, we're certainly very prone at anthropomorphizing our animals and such. But look, the ancient virtue or the ancient idea of virtue, the Greek word we translate into English is called arete, and that just means excellence, right? So, for instance, a knife can be virtuous as long as it cuts well and sort of performs its function really well. And of course, in that sense, dogs could perhaps have virtue, but again, in this very minimal sense, right? The reason why we as humans talk about moral virtue or character specifically is because there seems to be a bit more reasoning and reflexivity going on in our thinking, such that we don't just think, we think about thinking, right? And we reason about our actions, and we reflect back and say, if the situation happens again, I'll have different reasons. So it almost seems like, in the ancient sort of taxonomy, your really naughty dog, they would maybe be considered incontinent, right? It means that their desires and sort of general thoughts are very irrational. They just behave. Your disciplined dog might be called continent, and that just means they can reserve their behavior, they can listen to rules. But the truly virtuous agent, so in the human capacity, loves what they do, right? They enjoy being honest. So they don't just do it because they were punished or rewarded for it, but it's because that's what they are, is a honest person. And I think that's maybe where I would say, yeah, don't anthropomorphize in the sense that, dogs probably aren't honest and courageous in the sense that human beings are honest and courageous.
Right. Then when it comes to free will, that's an interesting view of things. I think it's very humanistic to think that we have free will because an AGI could probably predict pretty much everything that I'm gonna do at the very movement and the very time. Um, I think there's genes, yes, there's complexity out there. We just cannot calculate it right now, but I think that everything can be calculated, like Einstein thought about. What do you think about this?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you're basically trying to describe that you're in agreement with determinism, the view that the world is largely a series of causes and effects, and these things are sufficient and necessary to describe one another, right?
Yeah, everything is
And you're absolutely right.
predictable. Like we just don't
Yes.
have the technology to do it right now.
Right. If you could fill in each of the variables in the calculation, we could, in theory, predict an answer, right? Yes. Um, I'm sympathetic to this view, and you're right. This comes directly in conflict with the very human notion that we have free will. A lot of philosophers, maybe not the majority, but many are prone or keen on calling free will an illusion, right? To the extent that it feels like our decisions are up to us and can vary depending on our own reasons. But probably, if we're looking at physics, that's not the case. To be fair, though, that's one way to look at free will. Specifically in philosophy, we call that libertarian free will, right? So you have free decisions. When you decide, you could actually do the one or the other. So we couldn't predict which one you did, unless other than by looking at what you decide. But that's one version, right? We also have compatibilism, which is the view that we are reason responsive. That's a popular one, which means that we can respond to reasons, and in fact, our free will is only non-existent when we stop being able to do that, right? So psychosis or manipulation or anything like that, that would take away our free will. But to be clear, this is a very different conception of freedom as that sort of very deep metaphysical absolute sense in which decisions aren't determined, right? Under this view, they are still determined. It's just that it's significant that they're somehow attached and come from you. And we can talk about that. There are some interesting thought experiments that try to argue this point. But yes, there seems to be a conflict between free will and determinism. But I think there's a, a way that we can describe meaningful volition, moral action, even in a determined world.
Interesting. What about ethics and capitalism nowadays? Do you think that billionaires are virtuous? For example, I do think so for many reasons. I think they have a very special skill. I think they have very high tolerance to pain. I just think that if they're at some point, maybe there needs to be enough money for them, and maybe that money can be redistributed to society, which is most of the case. But I think nowadays a lot of people hate on billionaires. I talk to people that are like, "Yo, Zuckerberg is stealing your data. Bill Gates is behind his vaccination conspiracy theory." So what do you think about ethics and capitalism?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's difficult to say in the sense that well, at base I'm an ethical subjectivist, right? So I think we all just kind of the right thing to do is sort of the ideal decision you would make under rational consideration, right? And that's a very minimal conception of ethics. But even so, yes, I get what you're saying. Virtue, though, is a tricky thing, right? Technically, it's supposed to be one thing, right? So wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, benevolent, or all of these virtues, they're meant to be one and the same thing, right? And so, in other words, if you are, say, really, you have high grit and you're really courageous and you work terribly hard, but you're selfish or anything like that, that's technically, I guess, we would say you're acting with virtue sometimes, but you're not a virtuous person. And I think that's maybe the thing that people are latching onto with billionaires. I can certainly agree that a lot of billionaires, many most, have fantastic skills that would be valuable to most people. They work extremely hard. The bigger problem is just, I think it's when people look at the state of the world and they realize what distribution could do now, And it's difficult to square the wealth that's accumulated and the absolute poverty that exists. And that's always going to be difficult for people to justify, right? Even if that billionaire made their money through perfectly consensual and sort of means, right? Yeah, I almost want to say we can talk a bit more, but the short answer is that I think very many billionaires aren't virtuous, though they do display many virtues, if I can put it that way.
And do you think that folks in poverty have less free will? Do you think free will is a thing you can control and get yourself out of the quote unquote hole?
Um, I think perhaps the conception of free will I have isn't the appropriate concept to use here. So one could maybe say, do they have the same social currency or social mobility? And in that sense, certainly not, right? Not as a upper middle class or a billionaire. There's certainly difficulties there. Although I will say it becomes difficult. I think the problem is things like security, nutrition, community, and these things get disrupted with poverty and crime as they increase. And so those are probably the bigger problems. It's not necessarily not having money, but the fact that our societies are so centered around money, and then the absence of it leads to all these sort of terrible effects. That's probably what I would say is why capitalism can be, when you understand it as completely free trade, perhaps we can improve to it, right? Just a bit of community redistribution or government sort of planning and thinking. I think even a minimal amount of that is certainly appropriate, given the distribution and nature of the world, and as you say, the lack of mobility that poorer people might have. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think the greatest gift once you're at the top is to give back that knowledge so that these people can play around with it and hopefully get out of their physical and mental environment, which is what most of the time keeps them at that level, greatly
Exactly.
oversimplified. Let's talk
Yes.
about God for a moment.
Mm.
Think that Jesus was one of the greatest salesmen of all time. I think he ran a cult. I think he ran an
Okay.
organization, a business, right? He had incentives to do so. I think that God has been very useful over the time because we didn't have science and predictability, and the world has always been a very tough place to be, very fight or flight type of environment, and God would always be with you in this mind of yours,
Mm.
whatever the scenario at night. But nowadays, there's better gods, and it's called ChatGPT. It's always with me as well at night, and I can have a real conversation with it, not only in my head like a psychotic person would, quote unquote. That's a bit extreme. Um, what do you think about God, and do you think that we are creating a God with AIs and AGIs?
Right. So I'm personally, the term is agnostic. I am not certain on the claim there is a God or there is absolutely no God. I'm somewhat hesitant to affirm either of those. With that being said, I am very much in agreement with you that the vast majority of religions on this planet have served people's interests, community interests, sometimes nefarious, sometimes evil, oftentimes really just as a way to try and keep structure, albeit in a very flawed manner, right? And I think if you try and bring the AI into it, look, if you're a religious individual, in the same way that aliens would very likely kind of rock your worldview, I think true artificial general intelligence would do the same thing. I'm sort of that, especially because humans tend to have a very central perspective in a lot of the Western religious perspectives, right? And in that sense, yeah, let's say that ChatGPT does a better job of being grounded than something very abstract and human serving. I think the only problem is maybe that often what people miss out on, especially in the Western world, is that religions can both be a tool and a belief system, but oftentimes they're also just the glue that holds communities together, and also the indescribable aspects of a person's life. They like to attach that to religious experiences. And that I don't think could necessarily be captured by something like ChatGPT. And very likely we are going to continue to see, at the very least, political religions and secular religions, if I can call them that, continue to sprout up, even as science kind of tries to dispel some of the older myths.
Right. And whether it's a chat GPT or religion, extremists will always use these tools for pretty much wrong and us against them. So it's not really the fault of religion if we're seeing these conflicts nowadays. And yeah, Russia vs Ukraine is definitely not religious as well. It's very anchored much in geopolitics and
Yes.
rationality and advancing terrain. Um, I do think that AGI is a god, though, by definition, because a god is something we don't understand and something that is super powerful and that will show us the light, quote unquote, the right path, the
Mm.
truth, um, and hopefully some virtues. Obviously, there are many flaws in GPT, but I haven't seen a tool in history of humanity that is as close to the genie in the bottle, as close to the God, quote unquote. Now, I want to talk about some of the
Mm.
articles that you wrote, which are really interesting. I'm a fan of Stoicism, just like a bunch of people are a fan of God. Um,
Yes.
it helps me roll through tough times, and it's more anchored in reality and in science. It's anchored in psychology than is religion. So it's like, okay,
Mm.
what can I focus on that will add value and stop this negative momentum, which is pretty much how life is handled. Else you fall in depressive patterns and you get never get out of the hole that we talked about previously. So I
Mm.
just love Memento Mori as well, which is to be mindful of my death. Although I do want to live forever, I just think I could die right now from. I mean, I'm not God. I don't know everything about my health. I mean, I could be hit by a meteor or a landslide or whatever. I could die right now. So it's important to value life as well. So, what are your thoughts on the Stoic philosophy?
Right, yeah. So I quite like that you said in the beginning that you like Stoicism because it's actually kind of a better tool than classic religions because it's more grounded in science. But of course, the ancient Stoics were religious, right? They weren't atheists, but they had a very interesting perspective of God. God was sort of part of the universe. It was a universal reason. It was a logos. It was very, very sort of abstract. And in that sense, I think you're right. As time advanced, naturalism and the natural law just kind of could take that part over and we could keep a lot of the ethics. As you say, memento mori, it's a big one. Another one I like, technically never really vocalized by the Stoics, but Friedrich Nietzsche said amor fati, to love fate, was definitely a Stoic teaching. And it's basically this perspective that, right, as Marcus Aurelius says, what stands in the way becomes the way. The impediment to action advances action. It's seeing everything as an opportunity, including difficult people, right? They're just an opportunity for you to be kind and patient. And it's a difficult mindset, but I agree. I think a lot of what the Stoics said, as you say, is grounded in a sort of a holistic psychology. And I think it's certainly a pro to consider, reflect on these sort of ideas. I'm a massive fan of Stoicism. I'm maybe not, I won't consider myself a Stoic as such, but I'm deeply influenced by them, especially their moral psychology. Yeah.
Right, same here. I do believe in manliness as well in the age of confusion and disinformation and sheet day age. Um,
Mhm.
I read your post about the manosphere. Jordan Peterson, for example, I think he thinks he's a prophet or something. I did find value in his book. Um, yeah, the 11 lobster laws or whatever. The lobster
It's
law
the
was
12 of
quite
them, yes.
funny. Yeah, lobster and humans, the same. Although we do have
Exactly.
animalistic DNA for sure, but fucking lobster and humans, not sure. Anyway, and he loves to hear himself talk. I love myself. I love hearing myself talk. I do have a bit of megalomania, like a bunch of CEOs do.
Mm.
Although I am
Most
conscious of
creators
it.
do.
Right. Joe Rogan. I love Joe Rogan. I don't have much bad to say about him. He speaks his mind. He's authentic. This is like probably one of my top virtue, right? Like honesty.
Mm.
And I
Yes.
sometimes doubt Jordan's Peterson honesty, which is why he's lesser on the scale. But
Mm.
manlyhood, I do think there's tons of value in it. Why? Because um, there's a big problem in this world, and it's children's growing up without fathers. I think it brings confusion in them, energetic confusions. There's more femininity, and then they're constantly trying to find themselves in acts that they think are manly, like raping, like having multiple relations, like stealing, like doing crimes. They think this is manly, or riding a fucking hard, fucking loud Harley Davidson in the streets and annoying the fuck out of everyone. That's having a peaceful meal,
Yes.
or taking fights. Although I do believe there is sometimes value in a good old fight, um, a duel like our ancestors did. So, and yet I'm certainly against all the confusion that the woke people have brought. Like I know they want to be heard, but there's other ways to be heard in society. There's adding value to society and not confusing the fuck out of everyone. So I mean, long monologue here, but there's also characters like Andrew Tate that obviously had I don't want to use the word toxic masculinity because I think the woke crowd have got a hold of that. But I mean, he's been
Mhm.
raised by a father that's notions of masculinity are definitely on the extreme, and he's spreading these false values to younger peoples, which I think are confused that they didn't had a real father that taught them stuff. They had somewhat an absent father, or fathers that didn't know how to find their own values. Anyway, I think there's a lack of manhood. I won't use the term real manhood because I don't claim I have
Mm.
the holds onto that, but at least my definition of manhood after interviewing various manhood folks that I agree with, notably
Mm.
um, my friend Mr. Rubenstein that visited me here in Oaxaca, that does these manhood retreats. It's to build a community and to protect that community and to make sure that this community scale. That would be my definition of manhood, which is leadership. And I'm not excluding female from that. I think there's mad wisdom that females can bring to the table, but men, genetically with testosterone, I think they're best placed to take care and protect a community. While women, it's about nurturing that community, right? I'm very much into that of the role. So I'm sort of against what Andrew Tate stands for sure. He's great at marketing, just like Mr. Trump. And these folks are sort of ruining society. They're polarizing it. What do you think about that whole blabbering?
Yeah, a lot of really interesting points. Look, so first of all, yeah, there's certainly a distinction to be made between toxic masculinity, masculine traits, and the manosphere. When I use that word, it truly is to describe the reactionary, excessive sort of views of manhood, where being a man is described as being in opposition to a woman, for instance, or as something that a woman just cannot embody or whatever. I have no problem with describing masculinity, and it's certainly a fact that our societies will continue to have people who feel masculine, express masculine, need to be masculine, and they add to this beautiful, exactly like you say, this community. I am a bit hesitant, to be fair, to be honest, on a sort of gender essentialism, right, where I'm very strongly tying masculine traits specifically to genetics. I'm not denying that genetics have an effect in the aggregate. On average, this is certainly true. So in general, I prefer to discuss manhood and womanhood in terms of virtues, right? I just think it's more egalitarian to discuss that. But with that being said, you need spaces for men, just as you need spaces for women, just as you need spaces for children. You need these spaces to exist, and it's because it's how we form identity. It's how we add to the world, right? We first need a idea of ourselves and what we want to do and what we want from the world before we're going to start actually being a positive influence in it, right? And so, yeah, I think a lot of that is a lot of that sort of discussion has been what I want to say, almost like it is taken badly, right? So, for instance, a lot of people think any men's conference or men's rights issues is just that's toxic and that's gross. I think the reason for that is because a lot of that has been attached to people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson or such. But that's not to me say that I haven't met men who like to have time with men. And it's a great thing. They contribute, they build brilliant communities and children. They love their wives. they love their husbands. Like this stuff is, yeah, I think that's all fine. And in general, the problem I have with the manosphere is how reactionary and extreme they tend to take male behaviors. And maybe just the last thing I can say, an important aspect of virtue, right, is that it's seen as not excessive, right? So a virtue is any character trait or response to a situation which isn't deficient in the required trait or excessive in the required trait. And I feel like so often the toxic part of toxic masculinity lives in those. It's a lot of aggression and very little honesty, right? This sort of stuff. Whereas what we really need is it's fine for some people to be more aggressive than others and for some people to be less honest than others. But I certainly still think that we as a people should cultivate honesty and humility and these sort of things. That's, I think, the safest sort of comment I can give on that.
Me, I'm not going for safety at all. I'm going all in
Yes.
honesty. I think honesty is actually like more of a testosterone value because you're not afraid to speak your truth. While women most of the time would be like more delicate and constructive and would not want to go through confrontation, which is part of honesty. But anyway, that's another topic. I think bottom line, we're like nodes um playing under mother nature and the evolution algorithms umbrella, like we're small bits and
Mm,
we fight in some spaces and there's this full complexity. But yeah, like, oh, I'm against Andrew Tate, and then that brings another chain reaction. So yeah, and then that would bring a philosophical questions of do we really need these individuals in society? Are they beneficials? Are criminal people beneficial for society? For sure. One important point that I want to bring, though, again, it's related to capitalism. The other day, I was
mm,
reflecting that capitalism most created cancer with big sugar, um, and yeah, like the gases emission and so forth that is happening right now. But
right.
the question and the constatation as someone that makes content is that we tend to have different personality, right? So me, when I'm being interviewed on a podcast, I'm a bit more extreme and spicy because this makes for good content. And that brings more money. That's one. Two, um, it also like takes people out of their shell, and it explores other points to be discussed, which would tend to make more educational content, because else if we keep just repeating the classic stuff, we don't gain new neurons. And I think that people like Tate and Trump and even myself to some extent, we engage a lot into this marketing stuff. um I think capitalism has been mostly good for this planet Earth, but I also think it has like deep negative stuff just like this, that because if you speak to Tate in person, like on a private setting, he'll be way more moderate and he'll be nice. But that's also part
Sure.
of his game, right? It's like, hey, you might think that I'm this, but I'm manipulating you into thinking that I'm this nice guy in private person. What do you think
Yes.
about all this blabbering again?
Well, I quite like the point you made in the beginning about sort of the social net that we find ourselves in, the repercussions we have, all kinds of discussions. Maybe not exactly the point that you were making, but I think another important concept from Stoicism that people should reflect on, same as memento mori and amor fati, is sympatheia. This idea that Marcus Aurelius, the famous Stoic emperor, expressed that everything and everyone is interconnected, and that you cannot achieve your own good without achieving the good of others. And maybe that is the one criticism I would say of capitalism, is that the reason it could produce so much good and so much profit and so is because its main concern is growth, right? Its main concern is building on top of what is there. The Stoics specifically say money is an evil in this sense because it will distract you from what is truly good, virtue. And so I think as long as capitalism can be umbrellaed under a social understanding that what we're after is the common good, then I think we're probably going to end up being in a much better capitalist society than one that is content with simply saying, uh, profit is fine, you do you. I think we can expect a bit more from each other, to be honest. And that's, I think, what I would say about that. Yeah.
And do you think human nature is good compared to animals? Like animals, in my opinion, I don't think they're capable of much good. They're in fight or flight constantly. They're eating one another. They're being quote unquote cruel to another as a human being. Obviously, I think human can scale evil at a way higher scale. If I drop a nuke on the humanity, then yeah, that I'm just scaling evil. So what are your thoughts on that?
Awful. Yes, so I don't. So obviously, animals I don't think are capable of moral wrong and moral evil. So exactly as you say, if there were ethical patients and agents, what they do is awful, right? What a lion does to a gazelle, it's pretty cool on Natural Geographic, but man, I don't want to be that gazelle, right? So, 100%. But when it comes to human nature, I'm a I'm a bit of a sort of optimist and pessimist. So I think in general, human beings are pretty open to being taught to do almost anything, right? So I think we have capacities at base. We have a capacity to be honest and a capacity to be dishonest. We have a capacity to build and a capacity to destroy. And it's about sort of which of those you train, right? Again, as Marcus Aurelius says, the fire makes flames out of whatever you throw into it. And I do think that's for the most part what people are. Now, in general, I think we do an okay job. We're very good when we're community and group focused, and I think we're awfully bad when we're individualistic and sort of just thinking about ourselves. And those two natures is just the duality of humanity. And I think actually that's part of ethics is trying to grow the more reflective communal self of us, right? So yeah, human nature is a bit of a tricky mixed pot, and I think it takes effort for us to do good or do evil, which is why it's so terrible when evil happens, right? Because you just know people worked at that. So
But
yeah.
do you think we need evil? Coming back to a previous question, does it help society? Like, would I not feel righteous about myself if I couldn't point to this person asking, this beggar asking for money, or this person in jail and be like, I'm better than that person?
Yeah, I think so. I can kind of see why we would want to say some virtues are only possible because of certain situations that call